Hello, and welcome to Politics for the People. I'm your host, Michael Striano. Thanks for listening and joining in the conversation. You can find links to our Patreon and Instagram in the show notes and sign up for our weekly newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts to help others find the show. Okay, let's get to it. This week's episode was requested by our followers on Instagram, so be sure to leave a comment and let us know what you'd like covered on the show. Our topic is the filibuster. When I heard the word for the first time as a kid, I thought I was being pranked. And we're taught this idyllic history of America, and such an important part of the legislative process has a name as silly as filibuster. If it doesn't sound like a word that would be in our Constitution, that's because it isn't. So, how much do we know about the filibuster? What is it? Where did it come from? And how does it affect our daily lives? As always, let's start with a definition. The filibuster is a tool used to delay the Senate from voting on bills. It used to apply to nominations for the executive and judicial branches as well, but those possibilities were eliminated in 2013 and 2017. The filibuster also did exist for a time in the House of Representatives, but as the membership grew, the filibuster was eliminated in that chamber. Originally, a filibuster required a senator to hold the floor of the chamber, meaning they had to talk until the session was over, and the Senate was not allowed to do any other business while the filibuster continued. This is the most commonly known and famous example that most of us have seen in movies and TV. Think of Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or Amy Poehler in Parks and Rec. It's the most dramatic version, but it usually doesn't happen this way today. Because the filibuster prevented the Senate from being able to function, in 1972, the Senate introduced what is known as the two-track system, allowing filibusters to simply be announced so the Senate could move on to other business. This meant that the filibuster went from a highly dramatic, Hollywood-worthy act to a senator in the minority literally saying, hey, yeah, we're going to filibuster this. Prior to 1972, filibusters were much less common than they are today, mostly because the Senate does important work, and, as we just said, filibusters prevented any other business from taking place. Because laws still needed to be passed, filibusters were also used differently, more as negotiating tools, allowing the minority party to have a voice in what was passed by the Senate. The problem with this system was that a very small number of senators could completely prevent any legislation from being brought to a vote. Such was the case in 1917. As the United States prepared to enter World War I, they needed to protect their merchant ships from German U-boats, but the legislation to arm them was filibustered by 11 senators. President Woodrow Wilson chastised the Senate as the only legislative body in the world which cannot act when the majority is ready for action, and implored them to change their rules. The solution was called cloture, and meant that a supermajority vote of 2/3 could end a filibuster and bring the issue in question to an immediate vote. Even with the new cloture vote, filibusters completely blocking legislation were still fairly rare up until the 1970s, with the notable exception of civil rights legislation. From the 1920s to the 1960s, Southern senators employed the filibuster to almost exclusively block any civil rights legislation, including anti-lynching bills, workplace discrimination protections, and even the landmark Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1964. The filibuster of 1957 featured the very dramatic and record-setting 24-hour and 18-minute speech by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. Following the 1972 installation of the two-track system, the cloture threshold was lowered from 2/3 to 3/5 in 1975, meaning that the number of votes needed to end a filibuster was reduced from 66 to 60. After these two changes to the process, filibusters became much more common. We should note here that it's very difficult to track the exact number of filibusters since they're not recorded by the Senate. But tracking the number of cloture votes gives us a good indication of their frequency. There were less than 60 cloture votes from 1917 to 1970. That number steadily rose through the year 2000, eventually reaching 53 per year, before topping out in 2014 at 218. With filibusters becoming so common, it's amazing any laws get passed at all. In fact, for more substantial pieces of legislation, the Senate has turned to workarounds, basically technicalities that allow legislation to pass with a simple majority of only 51 votes. There are a couple of different ways to do this, but just to give you an idea of how it works, the most common is through a process called budget reconciliation. Originally created as a way to fast-track legislation affecting taxes, spending, and the debt ceiling, the only real requirement is that the law changes spending or revenues. Since nearly everything needs funding, which affects spending, this is a pretty effective catch-all to pass laws without having to worry about the filibuster. For example, budget reconciliation is how the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010. So, if the Senate is already employing workarounds to avoid the filibuster, and it's been eliminated for executive and judiciary confirmations, can we just do away with it altogether? Of course we can, and there are a couple of ways that could happen. The easiest would be for the Senate to change their rules by a vote, but that would require cloture, so it's unlikely to happen. What is much more likely, if the filibuster were to be eliminated, is the so-called nuclear option, which was used in 2013 and 2017. This can get a little confusing and in the weeds, but to put it simply, a senator starts a motion challenging a rule. Then, by a simple majority vote, the Senate can decide to override that rule and create a new precedent. Basically, they go through a bunch of procedural steps to say, we don't like this rule, so we're going to create a new precedent which invalidates it. This is all fairly easy and straightforward, so why hasn't it been done yet? We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, let's get a little background on where the filibuster came from. As I said earlier, it's not in the Constitution, and it's not laid out in any of the Senate rules either. In fact, it was created completely by accident. After the election of 1800, the still very young country was doing some bookkeeping and tidying up. With a few years under our belts to find out what worked and what didn't, we had a better idea of how to streamline the government and make it more efficient, or so we thought. One such rule that ended up on the chopping block was known as the previous question motion. It allowed a simple majority to end debate on a topic and move directly to a floor vote. Since it had only been used once, Vice President Aaron Burr suggested the rule be eliminated, and the Senate followed his advice in 1806. This created a loophole of sorts that wasn't taken advantage of until 1837, when the Senate saw its first filibuster. However, as we said earlier, these early filibusters were mostly delays meant to force changes to legislation rather than block it altogether. Every measure filibustered prior to 1880 eventually passed in the Senate. So why should we care about the filibuster? It's been attacked in the past, but the shifting nature of our government means that neither side wants to get rid of it out of fear. What will the minority party do when the roles are reversed and they are in the majority? This was enough to protect the filibuster until the recent polarization of our country. As we've seen in this episode, when the Senate has struggled to function, they've changed the rules to make it a little easier, which is what happened in 2013 and 2017 when filibusters were eliminated for the executive and judicial branches. 60 votes for cloture had become unattainable, and as we've seen in the years since, even 51 votes can be difficult to procure. Supporters of the filibuster often say it encourages bipartisanship to reach 60 votes, and that argument could certainly be made. But when dissenting voices are amplified by severe partisanship, senators quickly take sides and are unwilling to work together in any meaningful way to legislate. Opponents of the filibuster acknowledge that it essentially prevents any substantial legislation from having a chance at becoming law. Take the last couple of major pieces of legislation that have been passed: the Affordable Care Act and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Both were passed using workarounds. Our last two episodes were about the Supreme Court, and we looked at how the court has taken an outsized role in our government when the other branches stop working. There's certainly a case to be made that this is happening now, and the filibuster is undeniably a significant part of the Senate's inability to function. In recent years, it's gotten to the point where legislation isn't usually brought to the floor unless senators know it has the votes for cloture. That means partisanship has gotten so bad. Senators, our elected representatives in government, aren't even able to talk about issues and reach an agreement. In the past, even in times of severe partisanship, we've always found a way to work together. So why can't we do it again? What do you think? Do we need the filibuster so the majority opinion doesn't reign supreme, then give us all whiplash when the other party assumes power? Or do you think we'd be better doing away with it and really forcing everyone to work together for the good of the country without a safety net or excuse? Let us know by commenting on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast or emailing us at politicsforthepeoplepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to our patrons on Patreon for your help in making this happen and all those who have left us a review. Be sure to check out the show notes where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and follow us on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast. Want to help shape the conversation, have a say in episode topics, and get exclusive content, including early access to episodes and live conversations with me? Check the show notes, head on over to our Patreon page, and subscribe for as little as $3. We'll see you Wednesday with our newsletter and Friday with a brand new episode. Take care.